It began with a sound that didn't belong in the silence of the Alaskan wilderness. A woman's scream, sharp and haunting, slicing through the frigid air near the isolated fishing town of Cordova. The sound echoed off the frozen river, carried by the wind through the pine trees, then vanished into the night as if swallowed by the snow itself. People who heard it thought it was just a wild animal at first. Wolves cried out like that sometimes, especially in winter. But when the morning came and the scream was still lodged in everyone's memory, whispered over coffee and cigarettes in the small diner by the docks, fear began to settle in. By noon, that fear had a name: Rachel Monroe. Rachel was 27, a wildlife biologist who had come to Alaska from Oregon 3 months earlier to study salmon migration patterns along the Copper River. She was young, bright and endlessly curious, the kind of person who loved the wilderness even when it was cruel. Locals remembered her as the woman who'd hike alone into the forest for days, hauling her research equipment through waist-deep snow. She lived in a rented cabin at the edge of town, close enough to hear the river's groan when it froze over, but far enough that no one would notice if she didn't come home one night. When Rachel's supervisor reported her missing, the first responders found her truck parked outside her cabin, keys still in the ignition. Her notebooks and camera gear sat on the kitchen table, covered in neat handwriting and maps of the river. The place looked undisturbed except for the back door. It was open just a crack, snow blown in across the floor. Outside, searchers found a single boot half buried near the tree line. It was blood-stained, the leather torn. There were footprints nearby leading into the forest, then stopping abruptly as if whoever had made them had been lifted straight from the ground. Detective Eli Warner arrived 2 days later. A seasoned investigator from Anchorage, Eli had seen his share of murders and disappearances, but something about this one unsettled him. Maybe it was the isolation, the way Cordova felt like a world apart tucked between icy waters and endless woods. Maybe it was the way the locals looked at him when he arrived. Their eyes followed him everywhere, suspicious, measuring, like they knew something but wouldn't say it. The town itself seemed frozen in time. A single main street with a diner, a general store, a post office, and a small police outpost, manned by a sheriff and one deputy. The docks were lined with fishing boats locked in ice, their ropes creaking against wooden posts. A thin fog rolled off the river, swallowing everything beyond a few yards. People spoke in low tones, their words clipped short. Eli had investigated in cities where crime was a part of daily life, but here it felt personal, like every secret was hidden under the snow, and he was the outsider foolish enough to start digging. His first stop was the diner, the heart of the town where everyone's stories overlapped. The smell of fried fish and stale coffee filled the air. Conversations stopped as soon as he stepped inside. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee, his badge catching the dim light. The waitress, a tired young woman named Holly with pale eyes and bitten nails, poured him a cup without a word. When he mentioned Rachel's name, she hesitated, then leaned closer and whispered that Rachel wasn't the first to disappear. 2 women and 1 man, she said, all gone in the last decade. No bodies ever found. People called it bad luck or nature taking what it wanted, but Holly didn't believe in coincidences. She said there was something wrong with the forest, something that watched from the shadows. Eli didn't believe in superstitions, but he wrote down every word. After finishing his coffee, he drove out to Rachel's cabin. The narrow road wound through dense spruce trees, their branches heavy with snow. Her cabin appeared suddenly at the bend of the road, small and dark against the white expanse. It was quiet, too quiet. No animal tracks, no movement, just the hum of wind pressing against the windows. Inside, the air smelled of cold wood and dust. Her desk was cluttered with papers and maps, her handwriting looping neatly across each page. Among them, Eli found a journal bound in leather. The entries were methodical at first, notes about fish behavior, water temperatures, and seasonal shifts. But then, about a month before she vanished, the tone changed. She wrote about a feeling of being watched, about hearing footsteps outside her cabin at night. She mentioned seeing a truck parked near the river, headlights off, engine idling. She thought it was just a hunter at first, but the truck kept appearing in different places. The final entry, dated 3 days before her disappearance, was short and frantic. The same truck again, parked by the river. Whoever it is knows I'm watching them now. They came closer last night. The writing at the end was shaky. The pen marks pressed deep into the paper as though her hand had been trembling. Eli stepped outside and scanned the tree line. The light was fading, the air turning blue with dusk. He saw tire tracks near the edge of the property, half frozen in the mud and dusted with snow. They led away from the cabin and disappeared into the forest trail. The tracks were too old to follow, but deep enough to know whoever drove there had been heavy, maybe a pickup truck. As night fell, the temperature dropped to 15 below. Eli stayed in the cabin, keeping a fire going while he reviewed Rachel's notes. The silence outside was complete, the kind that felt alive. Around midnight, as the wind whipped against the windows, he saw something through the glass, a light flickering deep in the woods. It was faint at first, then grew brighter, like a lantern swaying. He grabbed his flashlight and coat, stepping out into the bitter cold. The snow crunched under his boots, each step echoing through the stillness. He followed the flickering glow weaving through the trees. The light vanished, then appeared again farther ahead. His breath fogged in the beam of his flashlight, and the trees loomed tall and motionless around him. When he reached the clearing, the light was gone completely. Only the sound of the river beneath the ice remained, groaning softly under its frozen shell. He swept his flashlight across the ground, and that was when he smelled it. Iron, sharp and metallic. He crouched and brushed away the thin layer of snow. Beneath it lay a torn piece of blue fabric caught on a root, stained dark at the edges. A few inches away, glinting under the light, was a hunting knife, its blade rusted and dull, the handle carved with the initials TH. The snow around it was disturbed, as if someone had knelt there recently. Eli's pulse quickened. He placed the knife in a plastic evidence bag and took a few photographs of the scene. He looked around once more, scanning the tree line. Something in the darkness moved. A shape, fast and quiet, gone before he could focus on it. The hairs on his neck stood on end. He called out, his voice breaking the stillness, but no answer came. Just the wind and the creaking trees. He made his way back to the cabin, every step heavy with unease. When he reached the porch, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. A single footprint, pressed into the snow beside the door. Larger than his own boot, pointing toward the cabin, not away from it. Someone had been there while he was gone. He turned his flashlight toward the trees, but there was nothing. Only shadows. Inside, the fire had burned low. He shut the door, locked it, and sat in silence, listening to the crackle of wood. He thought of Rachel, her journal entries, the fear in her handwriting, and the lonely road that led her here. Outside, the wind screamed through the forest again, the same sound that had started it all. A sound that could have been the wind, or something else entirely. For the first time in years, Eli felt truly afraid, not of what he might find, but of what he already knew. Something terrible had happened in those woods, and it wasn't the work of nature. Somewhere out there in the vast white wilderness, a hunter was still waiting. The knife with the initials TH etched crudely into the handle became the single thread Eli Warner could pull in a web that seemed endless and dark. He couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel Monroe had stumbled onto something or someone she was never meant to see. The next morning, he drove the knife into town to have it logged and tested. But in Cordova, even the simplest act of police procedure met quiet resistance. The sheriff, a tall man named William Harlan with gray hair and an unflinching stare, examined the knife under the dim fluorescent light of his office. He turned it over in his gloved hand, nodded once, then placed it into an evidence bag without a word. When Eli asked who TH might be, the sheriff hesitated. After a long pause, he said there was a man who lived upriver by that name, Tom Hensley. a trapper who sold animal hides and sometimes came into town for supplies. A loner, known for his temper and heavy drinking, but harmless enough. Harlan said he'd send a deputy to check it out in a few days when the weather cleared. Eli didn't wait. The next morning before dawn, he fueled up a snowmobile and followed the trail north along the Copper River. The air was razor sharp, cutting into his lungs with every breath. The trees hung heavy with frost, their branches bending under the weight of snow. It was a long, desolate ride, 15 miles of nothing but white silence and the hum of the engine beneath him. The sky was a dull gray, low and oppressive, and every sound seemed swallowed by the wilderness. When he finally saw the cabin, it was smaller than he expected. A single room of rough-cut logs with smoke-blackened windows and a sagging roof. There were no tracks in the snow, no movement, no sign of life. He dismounted and knocked on the door. No answer. He called out, identifying himself as law enforcement, but the only reply was the sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the wood. He pushed the door open, and the hinges groaned like something alive. Inside was chaos. Animal pelts hung from hooks along the walls, the air thick with the stench of decay. Traps, knives, and coils of wire littered the floor. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat on the table beside an oil lamp that had long burned out. A wood stove in the corner was cold and full of ash. The place looked abandoned, as if whoever lived there had left in a hurry. But it was what Eli found near the bed that made his stomach twist. A small silver necklace lay tangled in a heap of dirty blankets. The pendant was a delicate salmon charm, and Eli recognized it immediately from the photographs on Rachel's social media. She wore it in nearly every picture. He placed it carefully into an evidence bag and continued searching. Underneath the bed, he found a wooden box containing various trinkets. A broken watch, a few rings, and a woman's hair clip still tangled with strands of blonde hair. The discovery hit him hard. It wasn't just Rachel. Whoever Tom Hensley was, he'd been keeping souvenirs. Eli stepped outside and radioed the sheriff, but the static on the line was heavy, his words barely carrying through. He managed to send his coordinates before the connection died completely. The storm that had been gathering all morning finally broke, unleashing a curtain of snow that blurred the world into white. Visibility dropped to nothing. He knew he couldn't make it back to town in that weather, so he barricaded himself inside the trapper's cabin for the night. As darkness fell, the wind began to howl with the force of a living thing. The walls shuddered, the windows rattled. Eli sat near the stove, staring at the necklace, trying to piece together what kind of man Hensley had been. A recluse? A killer? Both? Around midnight, just as he began to drift toward sleep, he heard it. A faint crunch of snow outside, followed by another, then another. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. He grabbed his flashlight and gun, heart pounding. The steps stopped near the window. He held his breath. Then something heavy hit the door once, hard enough to shake the frame. He aimed his gun at it, but the door held. Seconds later, the sound faded into the storm, leaving only the wind. By dawn, the storm had passed. He stepped outside to find fresh tracks leading away from the cabin. Boot prints, not animal. They disappeared into the forest, heading west. He followed them for half a mile until he reached a clearing by the river. There, frozen in the shallows, was a snowmobile half submerged under the ice. The license plate was barely visible, but the name scratched into the side read T. Hensley. The machine looked like it had crashed weeks ago, maybe longer. There was no sign of the driver. The search teams arrived later that day after Eli managed to reconnect with the sheriff's office. They dragged the area, combed through the woods, and scoured the riverbanks. 2 days later, a pilot flying supplies over the Copper River spotted something dark trapped in the ice downstream. Rescue crews were sent to retrieve it, expecting to find Hensley's body. What they pulled out instead made even the most hardened locals fall silent. 3 human bodies lay encased in ice, their features pale and distorted from the cold. All 3 were women. One had the same build and height as Rachel Monroe. The other 2 were older, unidentifiable at first. The autopsies confirmed what everyone feared. They'd been strangled, their wrists bound tightly with nylon cord. All had traces of a chemical preservative used for tanning hides embedded in their skin. The coroner said it slowed decomposition, likely keeping them intact even in the thaw. For a moment it seemed simple. Tom Hensley, the angry trapper, had murdered these women and tried to hide them. The evidence fit too neatly. The knife, the necklace, the animal traps, it was enough to close the case. The sheriff held a brief press conference claiming the town could finally rest easy. Hensley was dead, the danger was over. But Eli didn't feel closure. He felt something gnawing at him, something off. He went back through Rachel's journal and her field recordings. The timestamps on the last few video clips didn't make sense. The footage of the river, the one she'd uploaded for her research archive, had been altered. There were frames missing, hours unaccounted for. Someone had tampered with them after she disappeared. The metadata pointed to a different location than her cabin, coordinates that matched a property registered to none other than Deputy Paul Avery. Avery was young, quiet, and well-liked around town. He'd been the first officer on scene when Rachel was reported missing. Eli remembered how calm he'd seemed, how he'd insisted that Rachel must have gotten lost or attacked by wildlife. When Eli brought up the video files, Avery shrugged it off, saying Rachel had given him copies to back up. But that didn't explain the upload timestamps. Someone had accessed them days after she vanished. The discovery opened a pit in Eli's stomach. He drove to Avery's home on the outskirts of town, a modest cabin surrounded by birch trees. The place was immaculate, almost unnaturally clean. There were family photos on the wall, a hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace, and not a speck of dust on any surface. It was the kind of neatness that felt like performance, a mask for something darker. When Eli asked where Avery had been the night Rachel disappeared, his answers came too easily, too rehearsed. He said he was on patrol, that the logs would show it. Back at the station, Eli requested those patrol logs. They arrived the next day, and immediately he noticed something odd. Several pages were missing. The time between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. on the night Rachel vanished was unaccounted for. When he brought this to the sheriff, Harlan dismissed it as an administrative mistake and told him to drop it. He said the department had its conclusion, that Hensley was guilty and Eli was stirring up trouble. But Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pushed away from the truth. The more he dug, the colder people became. The waitress at the diner stopped talking to him. The store owner pretended not to hear his questions. Even the deputy at the outpost looked away when he entered the room. The town, it seemed, had closed ranks around its own. That night, Eli sat alone in his motel room, staring at Rachel's necklace lying on the table beside him. The storm outside beat against the window, and he thought about the footsteps he'd heard at Hensley's cabin, the way the tracks led away from the scene. Whoever was out there that night, it wasn't a ghost. Someone was watching. Someone who knew every inch of that frozen land, every blind turn in the forest, every secret buried under the snow. He realized then that maybe Hensley hadn't been the hunter at all. Maybe he had been the hunted. And the true killer, the one who had stalked Rachel and the others, was still out there, hidden behind the trust of a small Alaskan town that didn't want its peace disturbed. When Eli closed his eyes that night, he heard the river again, shifting beneath its crust of ice, groaning like a living thing. It was the sound of something waiting to be uncovered, something that refused to stay buried. The morning after Eli discovered the inconsistencies in the deputy's patrol logs, a heavy fog rolled over Cordova, turning the town into a ghostly blur of shapes and shadows. He sat in his truck outside the sheriff's office, watching people move through the mist like sleepwalkers. Everyone seemed quieter than usual, their eyes down, their voices low, as if they were trying not to draw attention from something unseen. Inside, Eli could feel the tension tightening around him, a noose that had begun to slip slowly but deliberately into place. He knew he was close to something, but in Cordova, The closer you got to the truth, the less welcome you became. When he finally walked into the sheriff's office, Paul Avery was already there, standing by the window, coffee mug in hand. The sheriff, William Harlan, sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. Eli could feel the weight of both men's eyes on him. He placed Rachel's altered footage on the table, a USB drive containing the videos and metadata analysis he had run the night before. He explained calmly how the files were accessed from Avery's property after Rachel's disappearance, how her field data had been tampered with, how the missing time in the deputy's patrol log perfectly matched the hours she was last seen alive. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Avery laughed softly, a dry, humorless sound that didn't reach his eyes. He said Rachel had given him the footage herself, that she'd been afraid her research would get corrupted by the weather. He said Eli was twisting coincidences into a conspiracy because he couldn't accept that Tom Hensley was the killer. The sheriff nodded along, his expression hardening. He said the state police had already ruled Hensley responsible, and that Eli's obsession was making the department look bad. Eli stared at them both, realizing something in that moment that made his stomach turn. The sheriff's tone wasn't defensive, it was protective. He wasn't defending the case. He was defending Avery. And beneath that calm surface, something dark pulsed like a heartbeat. Eli asked why the patrol logs had been altered, why the timestamp of Avery's body camera footage showed gaps, why Rachel's GPS signal had stopped at the edge of Avery's property before vanishing. The sheriff stood abruptly and told him the meeting was over. Within an hour, Eli was officially suspended from the case for insubordination. He left the building in silence, the cold wind biting through his coat. He knew the suspension was more than bureaucratic punishment. It was a warning. That evening, he returned to his motel room, packed his files, and sat by the window, thinking about what Rachel must have seen that night by the river. A young woman with nothing but her research equipment and instincts had noticed something off, and it had gotten her killed. The same thing was about to happen to him if he wasn't careful. But walking away wasn't an option. Not now. At midnight, he drove out toward Avery's cabin. The road was narrow, hemmed in by trees that leaned like sentinels under the weight of snow. When he arrived, the lights were out and the windows were black. He parked his truck 100 yards away, turned off the headlights, and approached on foot. The cold was punishing, the kind that seeped through his gloves and bit into his bones. He moved around the side of the cabin, peering through a window. The inside was empty, spotless, unnaturally clean, every surface wiped, every corner bare. It was too perfect, too prepared. He picked the lock and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of bleach. The walls were lined with framed photographs. Avery in uniform, Avery with local fishermen, Avery shaking hands with the sheriff. There were no signs of personal life beyond those images. No books, no clutter, not even dust. Eli began to search systematically, starting with the drawers and closets. Nothing. Then, as he crouched near the fireplace, his flashlight glinted off something metal beneath the rug. He pulled the rug aside to reveal a loose wooden plank. Beneath it, hidden in a small compartment lined with black plastic, lay a collection of small objects. There was a bracelet made of blue beads, a woman's gold earring, a torn photograph of a young girl's face, and Rachel's field recorder, the same one that had gone missing when she disappeared. Eli's pulse quickened. He turned it on. The device crackled to life, and for a few seconds there was only static. Then the sound of wind and running water. After that, Rachel's voice, breathless and trembling. "I can see your truck," she whispered. "Why are you following me?" "Please, I just want to talk." There was a pause, then a man's voice, calm and low. "You shouldn't have come here, Rachel." The sound of a struggle followed, then a muffled cry, and the recording cut off. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He knew that voice. It wasn't Avery's. It was Sheriff William Harlan. The realization hit him like a blow. The man who had led the investigation, who had declared the case closed, who had accused him of obsession. He was the one who'd been there when Rachel died. Eli pocketed the recorder and hurried out of the cabin, scanning the dark tree line. He didn't notice the headlights approaching until they flashed against the snow. A vehicle was coming down the road fast, tires crunching on the ice. He ducked behind his truck, watching as the sheriff's black SUV pulled up beside Avery's cabin. The engine idled, then went silent. 2 doors opened. Eli saw Harlan step out first, followed by Avery. They moved toward the cabin, their breath misting in the cold air. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see the tension in their movements. The way Avery kept glancing nervously at the trees. Eli stayed low, gripping his gun, unsure if he should reveal himself or stay hidden. Through the window he watched Harlan pacing, his hands gesturing sharply as he spoke to Avery. Then suddenly Avery shook his head, stepped back, and pointed toward the woods. Harlan moved closer, said something else, and Avery's body stiffened. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Harlan raised his hand and a gun flashed. The sound of the shot echoed across the frozen valley. Eli's heart slammed against his ribs. He tried to stay quiet, but his foot slipped on the ice and the noise caught Harlan's attention. The sheriff turned sharply toward the sound, eyes scanning the darkness. Eli stayed perfectly still, crouched behind a tree. Harlan called out into the night, his voice steady, commanding, "Who's there?" Eli didn't answer. Seconds later, the SUV's engine roared back to life and both men were gone, swallowed by the winding road back toward town. When Eli reached the cabin again, Avery's body was gone. Only a pool of blood remained, seeping slowly into the snow. He knew he had to act fast. He sent the recording and a detailed report to his contact in Anchorage via satellite uplink, explaining everything. The evidence, the cover-up, the voice on the recorder. Then he packed what little he had and prepared to leave Cordova before the sheriff came back. But before dawn broke, the entire town changed. By sunrise, news spread that both Sheriff Harlan and Deputy Avery had disappeared. Their vehicles were found near the docks, engines cold, keys still inside. One of the boats used by the department was missing. The official report said they had likely gone out during the night and drowned in rough water. No bodies were ever recovered. The state police arrived days later, combing through evidence, questioning locals, reviewing Eli's findings. But by then, the trail was cold and the story had shifted. Without the sheriff or his deputy alive to face charges, the case collapsed under speculation and silence. The town refused to talk, each person claiming ignorance or fear of retribution. The authorities declared it a tragic end to a complicated investigation. A case closed by circumstance rather than truth. Eli left Cordova shortly after, his badge tarnished by controversy, his report buried under bureaucratic indifference. But the sounds of that place never left him. The scream in the dark, the voice on the recorder, the groan of the river moving under ice. Sometimes in his dreams he'd see Rachel's cabin, the open door, the snow-covered tracks leading into the trees. He'd wake in the middle of the night with his heart pounding, certain that if he opened his window, he'd hear that same faint sound drifting through the cold air, the echo of a woman's voice asking for help that never came. The wilderness of Alaska held its secrets tight. It didn't give them up easily, and when it did, it took something in return. Eli had gone there chasing answers and left with ghosts that would never stop whispering. In Cordova, the truth was buried beneath the snow, and those who tried to dig it up rarely came back the same. Some didn't come back at all. Years slipped by like slow-moving glaciers, grinding the past into silence. Cordova changed in small, almost imperceptible ways. New families moved in, old ones left, and the town rebuilt its rhythm as if the blood and fear that had soaked into its soil had never existed. The case that had once consumed every whisper and gaze in the town became something people only mentioned when the nights were long, and the snow fell too thick to ignore the ghosts outside. The sheriff's disappearance, the deputy's vanishing, Rachel Monroe's death, each was absorbed by the wilderness, folded neatly into Alaska's long memory of loss. Eli Warner had left the state 2 winters after the incident. His name still appeared in a few official reports, mostly as a cautionary tale. He'd been the detective who couldn't let go, the one who accused his own department, the one who broke into a deputy's house without a warrant. Officially, his suspension had turned permanent. Unofficially, everyone knew he'd been pushed out. He settled in Washington, working private investigations that felt hollow compared to what he'd seen in Alaska. He tried to tell himself that leaving had been survival, not surrender. But the cold followed him in ways he couldn't explain. Every time he saw snow, he thought of Rachel's cabin, the necklace he had found, the voice on that recorder whispering into the dark. In Cordova, winters always brought reminders. Locals still heard things on the wind near the Copper River. Strange cries, the sound of boots crunching over frozen ground when no one was there. It was easy to explain away. The wilderness had its own voices, its own tricks. Yet as the years went on, the story started again. A hunter swore he'd seen a light flickering deep in the trees near where Rachel's body had been found. A fisherman claimed to have seen a man standing on the opposite riverbank in the middle of a blizzard, motionless, watching. When they crossed to check, no one was there, but the snow was marked by heavy footprints, the kind made by boots. Then came the thaw. It was an early spring, the kind Alaska rarely saw. Ice melted faster than expected, rivers swelled, and the currents unearthed things that had been buried beneath the frozen surface for years. It was a group of hikers who found it first, a leather satchel wedged between driftwood near the Copper River Delta. At first they thought it was nothing more than debris, but when they opened it, the smell of decay mixed with the damp leather made them recoil. Inside were maps, yellowed papers, and photographs of faces half-faded by water. One of the hikers recognized a name scrawled in the corner of a page and took it straight to the Cordova Police Department. The name was Paul Avery. The new sheriff, a woman named Dana McKenna, called in the state authorities immediately. When the satchel was opened under controlled conditions, the investigators found a handwritten confession in Avery's shaky script. The ink was blurred in places, but the message was still legible. In it, Avery claimed that he had not killed Rachel Monroe or the other women. He wrote that he had helped Sheriff Harlan move the bodies from where they didn't belong, and that he had been under threat to stay quiet. He said the real killer wasn't Harlan either. Not entirely, but someone who lived among us, a man who belonged nowhere. The confession stopped abruptly halfway through a sentence, as though Avery had been interrupted or had chosen to stop writing altogether. The discovery reopened the case for the first time in years. Anchorage sent a new team of investigators to Cordova. They reviewed old evidence, reanalyzed DNA samples, and re-interviewed the remaining townspeople. But every lead turned cold the moment they touched it. The DNA found on Rachel's clothing, on the rope, and even on the knife from Hensley's cabin matched no one in the national database. The fingerprints lifted from Avery's satchel belonged only to him. There were no witnesses, no fresh suspects, just more questions about who this man who lived among us might have been. When Eli heard about the satchel, it was from a former colleague who called him out of curiosity. The story had hit the Anchorage papers, a small column buried beneath local election results. He read the article twice, his hands trembling slightly. He knew that Avery had never confessed during his life. The fact that he'd left behind something posthumous meant he'd known his end was coming. Eli couldn't let it go. 2 days later, he was on a plane back to Alaska. Cordova looked smaller than he remembered, but the unease hadn't changed. The people were polite but guarded, their smiles thin and their eyes evasive. The town had built new houses near the edge of the river, but Rachel's cabin still stood, boarded up, snow pressing against its sides, the wind rattling the windows like a restless spirit. Eli walked the property alone, boots sinking into the soft, thawing ground. The forest loomed behind it, dense and whispering. He found himself tracing the same path she might have taken the night she disappeared, toward the river where her footprints had ended. The snow had long since melted, but the place still carried that feeling of being watched, as if the trees themselves were keeping count of who entered and who left. Eli met with Sheriff McKenna later that evening. She was pragmatic, sharp-eyed, and unbothered by small-town loyalty. She told him the satchel had been dated to around the same time Avery disappeared, meaning he'd likely written the letter just before leaving with Harlan. She believed Avery's story about moving bodies, but she couldn't make sense of the rest. Who was the man he mentioned? And how had he avoided detection all these years in such a small place? Eli said he had a theory. He believed Harlan wasn't the killer, but rather the enabler. The kind of man who protected someone powerful or dangerous for reasons buried deeper than duty. That night, Eli returned once more to the site by the river where the bodies had been found years ago. The ice was gone now, the water dark and fast-moving. He stood on the bank and looked across the expanse, the wind cold against his face. The wilderness was vast, but something about this stretch of land felt wrong. The smell of rot lingered faintly beneath the crisp air. He scanned the opposite shore with his flashlight and caught the glint of metal. Crossing carefully over the stones, he reached the object, a rusted old trap half buried in mud. It was nearly identical to the ones he'd seen in Tom Hensley's cabin, except for one detail carved into its base. W.H. The initials stopped him cold. William Harlan, the sheriff. He turned the trap over, the rust flaking off in his hands, and realized what it meant. The trap wasn't new. It had been there long before the murders. Harlan had hunted here, maybe even used the place as part of his cover-up. But if that was true, where had Avery's man who lived among us fit into the story? Eli took photos, marked the coordinates, and left the site, the unease growing heavier with every step back toward town. The next morning, the sheriff's office received a call from an old fisherman who claimed to have found something near the inlet. A bone lodged in the roots of a fallen tree. Forensic analysis confirmed it was human, belonging to a male. The location was close to where Harlan's boat had supposedly disappeared years ago. But when divers searched the area, they found no full skeleton, no sign of Avery, no trace of clothing or metal from the boat. Just that one bone. The official investigation concluded nothing. Some believed the bone belonged to Harlan. Others thought Avery had killed him and fled. But the townspeople had their own stories. They said there was something out there, deeper in the forest. Something that had never been caught. Some even claimed it was still watching, just as it had watched Rachel and the others. Every winter, as the first snow began to fall, people said they heard the scream again, the one that had started it all, echoing faintly from the direction of the Copper River. Eli stayed in Cordova one last week before leaving for good. On his final night, he stood outside Rachel's cabin under a pale moon, the air sharp and silent. He could hear the river moving beneath the ice, the same low groaning that had haunted him years ago. He thought about Avery's final words about a man who didn't belong. Maybe the killer had been someone no one ever suspected. A drifter, a traveler, someone the wilderness had claimed as its own. Or maybe it had been something worse, something that wasn't meant to be understood by reason. When he finally turned away, the forest shifted behind him, the faint sound of snow falling from branches. He didn't look back, but as he walked down the long road toward town, he could feel eyes on him just like before. It was the same sensation Rachel must have felt, the awareness that in Alaska the wilderness never forgets. It holds its secrets beneath the frost, waiting for another thaw, another careless soul who thinks they can uncover what's been buried. By the time Eli reached the end of the road, the wind had picked up, carrying a sound faint but unmistakable across the dark expanse. A single scream, distant and echoing, fading into the cold. He stopped and listened, but it came only once. Then the night swallowed it whole, as Alaska always did, leaving nothing behind but silence.